this morning. We had a very engaging talk this morning, starting at 9:30, and we're continuing on with our sessions today. And I'm really delighted to have with us someone from the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Dr. Matt Shindell is a historian of science and technology whose work focuses on the exploration of Earth and the planets and the research programs that make exploration possible. He's a space history curator at the National Air and Space Museum and co-host of the museum's podcast, Air Space. He holds a PhD from the University of California, San Diego's History Department and Science Studies program. He also holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop. He curated the museum's permanent exhibition, Exploring the Planets, which I might add is probably no mean feat, or quite a challenge because of the renovations that's been going on at the museum. He also is lead curator of the New Futures in Space exhibition, and he also is the author of multiple books, including his latest, For the Love of Mars, A Human History of the Red Planet, which came out in 2023. His talk today, this morning, is entitled For the Love of Mars, the same as his book, with a subtitle of Our Changing View of the Red Planet. And indeed, the Red Planet has been in the news a lot lately with Elon Musk's changing priorities and so forth, and Matt might indeed touch on that as part of his talk. So without further ado, Matt, I'll give it to you.
Great. I'm going to start sharing and go into presentation mode. There, can you see my slides?
Looks fine.
Great. So thank you for that great introduction, Glenn, and thank you, Glenn and Dina, for inviting me to participate today. I really enjoy talking about this project to audiences whenever I get the opportunity. So it's wonderful to have another opportunity to talk about this work. So as Glenn said, I am a historian of science by training, and I came to the museum with that background and sort of then took on more history of technology when I became responsible for certain artifacts related to planetary exploration and the Earth sciences. And of course, that includes things like the incredible Mars rovers that have been exploring Mars now since the early part of this century. I mean, really back to the late 20th century, the very end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, and that have really defined how we go about exploring Mars. But, as a historian of science, I have to recognize that this is only the most recent way in which humans have interacted with Mars, that in fact, there's a very long history and probably prehistory of humans viewing and observing and sharing ideas about Mars and coming to conclusions about the nature of Mars and how it related to their existence and their life on Earth. That itself kind of begs the question of how people generate knowledge in different time periods and in different places around the world. And as a historian of science, I'm kind of trained to think about science as an activity that has taken a lot of different, sometimes contradictory forms over the course of human history. And to think of it as something that really we find everywhere when we find groups of people asking questions about their world and generating knowledge about that world. And, it might not look like the scientific method that we know today, and it might not use the types of tools that we have at our disposal, but that type of sort of collective, collaborative knowledge generation can still be thought of as science. And, collective is really the word here. This is about groups. And it's about science as a social activity that's done by communities of people in dialogue with their contemporaries, or sometimes with the people who came before them, once you get into the advent of written literature and print literature, especially, where people now are, in dialogue with people of multiple generations past because of the publications they left behind. So history, for me, is one way of piecing together all of those stories, all of the different time periods, all of the different ways in which people have thought about things in nature. And Mars is one of those things in nature that people have thought about a lot. And so that was kind of the the way of introducing my approach to this book, which really does look at multiple time periods throughout the history, recorded history primarily, of humans around the world looking at Mars and seeing different things. And one of the sort of premises or arguments of the book, I guess, is that Mars hasn't ever been the same place twice in terms of how different cultures at different times have seen it and the ways that they tried to make sense of it. It's always been very specific to times and places, including our own time and the ways that we explore it now and the ways we think about its connection to our future. And so, I wanted to I'll introduce you to a few different time periods that are covered in the book. In one case, I do in the one of the first chapter talk about ancient ideas about Mars, not just in Europe but around the world. And one of the cultures that I look at there is Mayan culture. The ancient Maya, of course, were great skywatchers and had their own ideas about Mars and incorporated it not only into daily life in terms of thinking about the ways that they use the stars and the planets to determine calendars and growing cycles, etc., for agriculture, but also in religious ways as well. The sky was very important to the Maya, and Mars played a role in that. Um, Moving forward in history, thinking about European history, especially and the medieval period, the sky meant different things to medieval Christians than it had to their ancient predecessors. For example, here we have the example of Dante's, Divine Comedy, and in the Paradiso, Dante makes his trip through the heavenly spheres, and I include that as an example here because it really reflects that Christian worldview that had taken the sort of idea of heavenly spheres that they had inherited from ancient thinkers and treated it in now a sort of a melding together of ancient ideas and Christian ideas about the purpose of the universe. And in Dante's journey, the Mars he experiences is one that's not just based on those ancient ideas of the heavenly sphere of Mars, but also on the Christian idea of what Mars's purpose would even be in the universe. And we'll get more into that a little further into the talk. And then a little bit after, after Dante, as we get closer to or into the early years of what we think of as the scientific revolution, we have figures like Athanasius Kircher, who writes his own voyage into the stars, similar to Dante's, also from a Christian perspective, because Kircher is a Jesuit priest. But now with the ideas that are coming out of the observations of Galileo and the ideas of Johannes Kepler, that Mars might be a world that is like Earth in some ways, but still sort of framed in a very Christian way, still with a lot of medieval influences. So we'll see that a little bit more once we get to Kircher. And then going even further or closer to where we are now, once we get into the late 19th and early 20th century, we now have the age of big telescopes beginning and folks trying to observe Mars closely and start to map the surface of Mars and seeing details that hadn't been seen before, some details that haven't been seen since, such as the canals on Mars that Lowell claimed to have seen. And then coming up to our present and thinking, positioning myself in some ways as a character in this story, thinking about what it means today to build a gallery about exploring the planets and to present Mars exploration there. And so, what is it that we know today about Mars and why do we care about it now? I think is an important question to ask as we hear more and more about possible missions to Mars and building possible colonies or communities on Mars, whether for scientific purposes, economic purposes, or just, the expansion of the human species out into the solar system. And of course, the stars, in my mind, of that Exploring the Planets gallery are the rovers that have done this work. So on the left, you see one of the most, I think, what I think of it as one of my favorite artifacts, in our collections, which is the flight spare of the Sojourner rover, the first rover to rove on Mars that was sent by NASA back in 1997. Ours is called Marie Curie because she was Sojourner's flight spare, and they were both named after American hero, or not American heroes, but heroines of history. So Sojourner was in fact named after Sojourner Truth, and Marie Curie was named after the famous French chemist Marie Curie. In the middle, we have our Mars exploration rover, which is an identical testbed version to the Spirit and Opportunity rovers that flew to Mars in the early 2000s, landed in 2004, and operated, at least Opportunity, operated for around 15 years on the surface of Mars, exploring and roving around. And then finally, we have our display model of the Curiosity rover that flew to Mars more recently in 2012, and of course has a very similar design to the Perseverance rover that landed on Mars just a few years ago and has been drilling and collecting rock samples on the surface of Mars for a potential future sample return mission. But let's step back for a moment, way back to, even time periods before recorded history, to, why Mars may have attracted human attention in the first place. And it does have to do with time, and has to do with the way that Mars moves in the sky over time. So we know today, of course, that Mars orbits the sun just outside of Earth's orbit. It's our next neighbor as you move outward in the solar system, and it orbits more slowly than the Earth. A year on Mars is about twice as long as a year on Earth. And so there are these moments that occur every 2 years where the Earth comes up and surpasses Mars in its orbit. And looking from our perspective on Earth, maybe not knowing what's happening in terms of these, relative positions and orbits, what Mars appears to do in the sky during those moments is get brighter. Sometimes it changes color. It can go from sort of a wheatish hue to a very bright reddish hue for a careful observer. And it can seem to sort of change direction and do a little loop in the sky during what scientists call an opposition. And this movement they call retrograde motion, which is just a product we know today of our motion and Mars's motion relative to each other and the way that we observe the sky from our fixed, what we consider a fixed point on Earth. And the other thing to know about this is that it's not the same every time it happens. So every 2 years, you'll see an opposition of Mars in the sky, but every 15 or 16 years, that opposition is actually much more dramatic, brighter, etc., because Mars is much closer to us, because of course our orbits are not perfect circles, they're ellipses, and so sometimes Mars comes very close, relative to those other times, and that can put on a much more dramatic show. And so, we can see how Mars, with this sort of seemingly, in some ways, unpredictable type of motion, where not only is it moving across the sky with the other planets relative to the fixed stars, but it's also, changing direction, doing loops, getting brighter in different ways from every 2 year period, might, attract the attention of humans and make humans think that something's actually going on with Mars that's worth paying attention to. And so, in fact, that is what we see throughout history, is people paying attention to the movements of Mars over time and, trying to get information from that about Mars's relationship to life on Earth. So we see it in the Maya, as I showed you, the temple in that early slide. When we look at some of the written records that the Maya left behind, in this case, one of the codices that was preserved of ancient Maya life, we do see perhaps the appearance of Mars in those codices. So as we know, the Maya were an agricultural civilization. I shouldn't say were, the Maya still exists today, but I'm talking specifically now about the ancient Mayans. And they were very interested in coming up with sort of calendars and sort of predictive methods that would help them in those agricultural practices. They had a fairly large population to support through agriculture, and so they really depended on understanding the rainy seasons, the water cycles, etc. And so what we have here comes from what archaeologists have identified as a water table from one of those codices that's been preserved, and what they've said we could be looking at here is what they've identified as the Mars beast, a sort of zoomorph made up of different animal characteristics that appears to be coming down from what they call a sky band, which is, a representation of the constellations in the night sky, and so where Mars is being seen at different moments. And they argue what we're seeing here is Mars coming down further and further and becoming more noticeable as it moves through the sky. So perhaps what we're seeing here is an opposition of Mars. And because it's in the water tables, they argue that at least for a time, Mars's oppositions may have lined up in a meaningful way with rainy seasons that were important to track for the Maya. So they were definitely paying attention to Mars. We know they paid a lot of attention to Venus and based their calendar on the motions of Venus, but Mars also seems to have had a place in their calendrical practices. Then, I said earlier that it also played a role in sort of religious practices, which were very wrapped up also in political practices, in legitimating, the rule of the Mayan kings of each Mayan city-state. And so there is also a way in which Mars participated in ritual events. Here we have the Temple of Inscriptions in Palenque, and there is this way in which the stars and the planets participated in sort of annual ritual events and also more particular ritual events, like when a king would die and his heir would take the throne. And the architecture of Mayan cities was built such that these events would take place sort of in particular views of sort of buildings and horizons. And so, it has been recorded by, let's see, I've got to consult my notes, which I haven't been looking at, and so I've lost my place. But let's see. Yeah, so let me just sort of jump back just a little bit. So this, of course, would be a public event, and one of the public ways that the planet's participation in mythology and in also the governance of nature, which the ancient Maya saw themselves as in relationship with nature, including the planets, that all humans and gods and animate and inanimate parts of the universe were basically working together to sort of create a livable world. And one of the ways that was expressed was through the reenactment on an annual basis of the Mayan creation story, the Popol Vuh, that established, among other things, the king's relationship to the gods who had enacted the creation in the first place. And in these reenactments, the world was understood to be connected to the sky and the underworld, and the night sky visually replayed parts of the story in the annual ceremonies around the Popol Vuh. So the planets in the sky would be taking on the roles of some of the gods from the creation. And we know that in the night sky around 690 AD, that the sky over the Temple of Inscriptions that night helped to reenact this creation story at the time of one of the Mayan kings' deaths. And anthropologists argue that what they watched that night during the ceremony was the reunion of the three original gods of the creation that had given birth to their ancient ancestors. And Mars, in particular, on that night, which was shining bright and moving slowly through the constellations, was associated with one of the original gods, the oldest and one of the sort of most powerful Mayan priests, Itzamna, who you see there on the right. And so, Mars was participating in governance, it was participating in religion, it was participating in agriculture. And what they saw when they looked at Mars was sort of a combination of all of those things. So jumping forward now to, medieval period, the medieval period, what we have now is very different from what the Mayans saw. So, there was a sort of tradition that was established in ancient Greece of thinking about the planets in a sort of specific type of arrangement to each other, and thinking of this whole arrangement with the Earth at the center and the planetary spheres moving outward from that as being sort of a world mechanism. So they're not necessarily thinking about the Earth as a planet at the center of this. They're definitely not thinking of it as a planet. Instead, they're thinking of the Earth as one particular realm of this larger world machine. So the sublunar world, as they would have thought of it, was everything that we sort of take for granted about life. Its change, its growth, its death, its, corruption, to put it in a sort of a negative light, but change in general is what they're talking about, and everything above the moon included, is made of another material, right? That is uncorruptible and that doesn't change. And so this sort of worldview that's established in the ancient period, by Aristotle, and then later in the early medieval period, or late ancient, early medieval, kind of on the cusp, by Ptolemy, the astronomer, the Roman astronomer, based in Egypt, is kind of, uh, established and brought forward into medieval Christian thinking. And, one of the interesting things when you read Ptolemy is he is, an astronomer. He's also a knowledgeable astrologer. And so in Ptolemy's books, you not only have, great treatises on astronomy and all of the best practical knowledge of astronomy up to that point, but you also have a four-book treatise on astrology called the Tetrabiblos, or the Four Books, in which Ptolemy lays out the purpose for this whole scheme, which is that each of the planetary spheres has its own influence on the changes that happen below the moon in the Earth and that sort of realm of the Earth. And so each of the planets in that scheme has its own kind of properties that affect things on Earth. So Mars, in Ptolemy's worldview, um, it's has a role in determining, for example, the mental character and physical features of people of the world. So different regions are affected differently by Mars and by the other planets. And it also has, an effect on affecting the properties of those lands themselves. So it plays a kind of a geographical role as well. And as Ptolemy described it, the nature of Mars was it was a hot and dry planet as opposed to being wet or cool, etc. And its role in life on Earth was chiefly to dry and to burn. So Mars could have pretty negative effects on life on Earth, and it was considered in that way a malevolent planet. It could bring about all kinds of ill effects. Its dryness could cause political problems. It could cause war, tyranny, civil unrest, arson, murder, piracy, enslavement. On the body, it could cause symptoms like fevers, or it could even cause swift and violent death. It could cause conditions of the air to become stagnant and malignant as well. And so Mars could be associated with all kinds of problems in Ptolemy's scheme. And it's here where we kind of see this relationship between the sort of world system that I showed you before, where you have the nested spheres, and the human body, because coming out of ancient times and then solidified within sort of medieval Islamic, Christian, and Jewish worldviews was this notion that the body itself was a microcosmos, right? So you have the larger cosmos that contains those planetary spheres and their motions and how they affect the Earth itself. And then you have the microcosmos, which is basically sort of a miniature version of that, in which the movements of the planets and the stars are also affecting what's happening in the body. And so medicine was also very rooted in this understanding of the sort of importance and the role of planets. And so that is just to establish then when Dante travels, as I said before, through um, the heavenly spheres in the Paradiso, what he's witnessing there is very much informed by ideas about the purpose of the universe, and the sort of nested sphere system that I've described here, which is, in the Christian worldview, it's all established by God to enact God's purposes, right? So each planet has a purpose that's dictated by God, and the movements of those planets has been established in order to make the things happen that are part of the divine plan. And God himself then resides at the edge of those spheres in the holy Imperium. So in Dante's story, as he's traveling through the planetary spheres, he's actually getting closer and closer to God on his journey. And one of the things that Dante does in the course of this journey is explore the purpose of the planets and kind of understand how, or presents an understanding of how Christians have incorporated ideas of, for example, astrology and the idea of planetary influence into their ideas about the planets. But one of the problems that Dante runs into, I think of it as a problem, Dante may not have thought of it as a problem, is that Mars has all of these very negative associations in astrology. And as opposed to when he was moving through the levels of hell, which each were associated with a different vice, as he's moving through the planetary spheres, he decides that each sphere is to be assigned a different heavenly virtue. And so how could he associate a virtue with a very negatively seen planet as Mars that was always associated with bad omens and bad effects on the body? Well, he decides to sort of turn it around and make Mars the planet of fortitude. Yes, it's a planet of death and things that we might think of as negative, but it's actually reserved for the souls of martyrs who were killed for fighting for their faith. And so Mars is filled with Christian martyrs. Chief among them, of course, would be Jesus Christ, who's not there, but is represented through the symbol of the cross. So as Dante approaches Mars, what he sees is this incredible glittering light show, and experiences auditory experience as well, is that he's hearing all of these great hymns. So it's a very religious experience for him as he's approaching Mars. And so he meets these martyrs and he sees them sort of lighting up the cross with their souls as they're moving around it. And, this then becomes how he understands Mars, or how he thinks we should understand Mars as he's passing by it. But again, very much rooted in this time and place where Dante is writing, and very much reflects this period in Christian thinking. And then moving forward then into this sort of early scientific revolution, where we start to see Mars viewed as a world. I like to talk about this example of Athanasius Kircher, because Kircher is a figure who, for historians of science, he's kind of a confusing figure, because he's not a Galileo. He's not trying to sort of overturn old ideas of astronomy, but instead he's kind of got one foot in the old world and one foot in the new world of astronomy, in that he still wants to think about the planets in terms of their purpose in a Christian world. So he's, like Dante, thinking of the planets as having influence on the world, influence on the body, but he's now also thinking of them not as solid spheres surrounding the Earth the way that Dante was, but instead is thinking of them as worlds, similar to what Galileo was seeing through the telescope. But what he presents then is a very kind of interesting combination of those things. So, for example, using the example of Mars, right, which of course is this purpose of this talk, what he's seeing then when he gets to Mars is a planet that's very much informed by the sort of astrology that he very much believes in, and also the alchemy that he's practiced as sort of one of his forms of science. He was an incredible polymath who was wrong about so many things, but practiced so many different types of science very seriously there in Rome. And what he was able to do in combining those things was construct a Mars that was very sort of physical, I would say. So, for example, as he's approaching Mars, he is being guided by an angel who comes to him in a dream and takes him on this journey. And he relies on this angel to explain things to him as he's going along. Um, and so, as he's approaching Mars, he starts to feel really angry, to feel really angsty, and like he wants to fight, and like he's very upset and anxious, and he's just doesn't understand what's coming over him. After all, he is you know he is a Jesuit priest, right? Not known for their fighting instincts. But the angel explains to him, right? This is the influence of Mars. This is what Mars is, known for, right? Is causing people to take up arms, to be the planet of war, to cause people to feel badly. And so she gives him a sort of antidote to this that allows him to actually land on the planet Mars with the angel so that they can sort of take a closer look at what's going on Mars. Um, and even then, Mars is a very unpleasant place. Even without the sort of emotional influence, the physical nature of Mars is very unpleasant. It's covered in burning lava and pitch and mountains of tar. It's just the most unpleasant place you can imagine being. And Kierkegaard, or his alter ego in this journey, does not want to spend much time on Mars at all. And he actually asks the angel, why? Why would God create a planet like this that's so awful? And she basically gives him an answer that's similar to what I think of as sort of the moral of the book of Job, right? Don't ask, right? It has a purpose. And it's not for you to understand it, but think of how all of the planets have their own purposes, and Mars's purpose is to do what God wants it to do. And it does that in conjunction with the other planets, and together all of the planets produce everything that you love and enjoy on Earth. So, don't ask about things you couldn't possibly understand is sort of the moral. Just trust that there is a plan. And just to give you a sense, Kierkegaard, of course, was still very rooted in this tradition of thinking of the planets as having an influence not just on the Earth, but also on the body itself. This is one of Kierkegaard's own charts from one of his books. And so I just wanted to throw that in there. So you see, none of that has gone away for Kierkegaard. Now let's jump forward to the late 19th, early 20th century. As I mentioned earlier, astronomers like Percival Lowell were seeing things on Mars that indicated that maybe it had life on it. So not only is Mars a world in the way that Kierkegaard now was starting to see it in the 17th century, but now Mars is a world where there could even be intelligent life like what we find on Earth, and where what Martians are going through on Mars is similar to what we may be going through in the future. That was how Lowell viewed it. Lowell viewed Mars as a planet that was drying out, that was becoming a large planetary desert, and where intelligent Martians were undertaking a huge civil engineering project to move water around the planet. And this is why he said you saw the canals through the telescope, that their arrangements changed from year to year, was that they were trying to sort of keep up with a planet that was becoming less and less habitable. And Lowell believed that this was because Mars had formed earlier than Earth, and that Earth would ultimately go the same route. And so Lowell had a line that I like quite a bit, which was that the frightening things about deserts is not that they exist, but that they are coming into existence. So he thought that the deserts of the world were just the beginning of what would become sort of a desertification process of the entire planet. And of course, science fiction writers picked up this idea. Each chapter of my book does point to a different sort of author who's played with these ideas, but now is when we get to the point where we can actually call what they were doing science fiction. So, H.G. Wells very famously wrote The War of the Worlds in the wake of Lowell's pronouncements about Mars, and also this sort of Mars fever that took place at the end of the 19th, or yeah, end of the 19th and the early 20th century, in which people really were excited about the idea that Mars had life and wanted to discover evidence of that life. And so Wells takes that idea and turns it into a story of Martian invaders who come to Earth looking for the resources that they are losing on Mars, and presents them as sort of a foil for British colonialism, and the ways in which Britain had gone around the world, treating other humans as non-human, and trying to raid resources to bring them back to England. So, Wells uses that as a great sort of premise for his, in many ways, I'd call it a satire of British life and British society, which also is one of the most enduring science fiction stories, probably, of all time. It's been made into so many different movies over the last decades, and continues to be reimagined and reimagined. And then closer to the present, of course, we have the dawn of robotic Mars exploration, which began in the mid 20th century with flybys, and then with orbiters, and then finally, to close out that first period of robotic exploration, the landing of the two Viking landers on Mars in 1976, which, of course, this year is the 50th anniversary of that landing. But it represented a very new way of interacting with the planets, not looking through the telescope and looking for signs of intelligent life or of any life at all, not thinking about it through astrology, not thinking about it as connected to sort of a creation story as we've seen in those previous eras, but now thinking of it as a sort of a world with a family relationship to Earth, in which we were going to now be able to explore and learn things about how the planets of our solar system formed and why our planet seems to be different from others. So, of course, one of the first great revelations of planetary exploration when it came to Mars was that Mars had no visible life on the surface, and in fact, no visible liquid water on the surface. And this kind of then defined our idea of Mars, pretty much up into the present, although some things have changed that I'll talk about in a minute. But this first photo mosaic globe of Mars, which was produced in 1972 by Mariner 9 that you see on the right, really becomes the new Mars of planetary exploration, which is Mars as a world of rock. Mars, where geology is the key science of understanding and unlocking the history of Mars and its relationship to Earth. And we see that reflected in science fiction. Here we have two of the sort of special effects and props masters for the 1990 film Total Recall, which is one of my favorite Mars movies of all time. And here they are standing in this set that they've built, filled with miniatures that depict a mining colony on Mars, which is the center of the action of the film. And, this for them, they're taking that idea of Mars as a planet of rock and, building essentially a sort of idea of what a sort of planet of rock could be used for: mining, extraction, the types of things that were already happening on Earth, now sort of projecting them onto Mars as an extension of that. And of course, one of the ideas that's played with a lot in this film, thanks to its director, Paul Verhoeven, was capitalism. Right. This is very much a film about how capitalism affects the lives of people living in sort of, in this case, the Mars colony, the mining colony, which is, if I can borrow that word, microcosm from the medieval thinkers, is sort of a microcosm of that larger sort of extractive capitalist world that Verhoeven was attempting to critique. And then now going up to today, of course, that planet of rock, we haven't mined it. We've been instead exploring it with a series of rovers, and most recently, along with the Perseverance rover, a small helicopter that we've used to explore the surface of Mars. And what we've mainly done on Mars is search for evidence of, what type of environments may have existed there deep in its past. And this idea that's become prevalent since, I think, the early 2000s, that Mars may have had once a warm, watery past, where it was much more Earth-like and may have even fostered the origin of some forms of life on the planet. And the ways to look for them is with instrumented rovers that can detect where the water was, um, and even any sort of potential fossilized biosignatures. And so, this has been the mode of exploration, and the purpose of exploration has been looking for that history of water and potential history of life on the planet. And in some cases, also thinking about there have been a couple of experiments to test out technologies that might one day facilitate human exploration of Mars. And the ways that that information has been shared and consumed by people is also, again, very different from previous eras. We're not reading Dante. We're not, attending ceremonies where we're watching Mars. Instead, we're sharing photos and videos of Mars and the rovers on Mars via social media. And the ways that the rovers operate and interact with the public is also very much the ways that we interact with each other via social media. It's not sharing images of its, dinner at the restaurant that night, but it's sharing images instead of what rocks it's looked at most recently. And thanks to NASA, also has often had a voice of its own. So in early on in the sort of landers and rovers missions, it was the age of the beginnings of Twitter, and the I think it was the Phoenix lander who first had a Twitter account. I might be wrong about that. I'd have to look at my notes, which I haven't been looking at. But it was assigned a voice through a Twitter account, and the social media person who was in charge of that, the communications person at NASA JPL, decided instead of trying to write it in the NASA voice, they would just give the rover its own voice and have the rover tweet in sort of a first person voice from Mars. And so the rovers themselves have been somewhat anthropomorphized in that way and allowed to seem, or at least seem to, participate in our social lives as though they were one of us. Also, the images of Mars that the rovers have produced over these last 20 years or so have really made Mars feel familiar to us. Not only does Mars kind of look similar to the desert environments that we have on Earth, like the Mojave Desert or, deserts around the world, but they also, seem like they have been inhabited, right? We've seen them from the sort of first person perspectives of those rovers, on which the cameras are typically at the height of the average human set of eyes. And so we feel as though we've stood there, even if we haven't, or we feel as though we've seen someone's vacation photos. And so it's very easy then to replace the rover in those rover selfies with, a character like Mark Watney on Mars. It's also easy to imagine, and science fiction helps us to imagine what it might look like even further into the future, when we have actually built human settlements on Mars. So this is a scene or a still from one of my favorite recent sci-fi series, The Expanse, in which you see the types of communities that have been built inside of the rock of Mars without really terraforming the planet. They've instead made the sort of the cliff sides habitable, and have existed on Mars for enough time through enough generations to consider themselves Martian rather than, Terran or, Earthling. So they have their own politics and their own social identity and see themselves in many ways as at odds with people who still live on Earth. This is an object that we collected. I like to throw it in because it's one of my favorite objects, one of my favorite sci-fi objects anyway, that we've collected. And we collected it for the Futures in Space gallery that Glenn mentioned in his introduction. This was a screen-used prop helmet or costume helmet that was worn by the actor Frankie Adams in her portrayal of Bobby Draper in The Expanse. And this was part of a whole power armor type suit that she wore for ground combat as a Martian Marine, going back to ideas, from earlier science fiction of the sort of ground combat that humans would have to do in space at some point, which we haven't thankfully had to do anywhere in space. But making that real through the idea of this Martian society that's protecting its own interests out in the solar system. And as I said before, we have this idea now of Mars as having once been this warm, wet planet, very similar to Earth. And from a scientific standpoint, lots of great questions about why did Mars take a different path than Earth, and what could potentially happen to Earth if things happen to it that happened to Mars, like losing its magnetosphere, for example, which would allow the atmosphere to be stripped from the planet, which is what happened on Mars, or at least that's what scientists believe happened on Mars. And can Mars be habitable again at some point in the future? If it did have a warm, wet past, can it have a warm, wet future, or at least some kind of limited habitability like what we saw in the Expanse example? And so NASA has in the past years, the recent past, been testing technologies that would allow for human missions to go to Mars and perhaps start experimenting with the types of life that would be possible on that planet. Of course, as we know, this sort of long-term planning for human spaceflight has its own kind of, pitfalls. It's very connected to politics and political will and, large budgets. So we see a lot of a history of planning for Mars missions that haven't come to fruition, but we don't know what could happen in the next 10 or 20 years. Maybe these technologies will lead to something real in terms of putting boots on the ground on Mars. And so that's where I want to leave it, is just reminding us that this vision of Mars is ours. It's something that's been developed just in the past couple of decades. And these ideas of its connection to our possible future, while a little bit longer, going back into earlier science fiction, are also ours. It's not something you would see in previous eras. And of course, it can all change. But that's the sort of point I want to leave it on, and remind you via this slide that as a public servant, you can reach out to me anytime. That's my email address. And also, you should also check out the podcast that I co-host for the museum. It's a lot of fun. If you're interested in aviation and spaceflight, I think we can entertain you with some of our episodes. We have like 11 seasons now, so there's a great number of episodes to choose from. And so I'll leave it there and take any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. We do have some time for a few questions before we begin our next speaker at 11:30, so I'm going to entertain those. One of them that I'd like to start out with that's been at the back of my mind, because I did read your book, For the Love of Mars, that came out, which I really enjoyed. But I was wondering if you could care to speculate on this question. It's probably a two-parter. One is, I used to go into schools, and I still do to some degree, and talk to kids, especially elementary school kids, about space and the history of space. And for many years, it used to be, I'd respond to someone in the audience about, somebody here in this classroom might very well be the first person to, walk on the surface of Mars. But I've kind of changed that a little bit more to perhaps that not so much happening immediately, to the question of, what would happen to you if we found evidence of life in our solar system, either microbial or prehistoric? And I know, of course, with the samples that are being obtained on the surface of Mars by, I believe, Perseverance, and those little samples being remained, there are efforts, perhaps not so much by the U.S. right now and recent, but others to continue on with the goal of sending samples back to Earth so that we can examine much closer here from Mars. What are your thoughts? I guess it's a two-part question. First of all, do you think within your lifetime, certainly, we might find evidence of life, not the kind of life that we could stand up to and shake each other's hands and say hello, but perhaps prehistoric, fossilized life? Do you think that's a very real possibility, especially on Mars, since we've had such a concerted effort of exploring that and are ready, just if we can get the technology and funding to return those samples to Earth for closer study and examination, but also in the outer planets, on the icy moons, with the Europa Mapper and so forth, that's on the way out there to kind of recon for perhaps further exploration out in the outer planets to find liquid water under those surfaces and perhaps life there. So do you think that is a possibility, certainly? And then the response, if we do find evidence, how do you think that will affect our history, our view, perhaps with Mars, since that seems to be the closest and most likely candidate right now where we could perhaps find fossilized evidence of life on Mars. So that's a two-parter. I'm sorry, it's kind of winded, but I thought that
Yeah.
way.
Well, I have to be careful and not get myself in trouble like Obama did recently by saying that, of course, there are aliens. Um,
Right.
but of course, there are aliens, right? If you think about it statistically, it's hard to come to the conclusion that there's not other intelligent life somewhere in the universe. Whether or not it's in our own solar system or even can be, contacted in any way, given the great distances between things, that's another question, right? But yeah, the emphasis of Mars exploration for since the beginning has been finding life or determining whether or not Mars ever had life. And the ways that we ask those questions has changed over time. We went from looking for like if you look at the biological experiments that were included on the Viking lander in the 1970s, those were all trying to detect metabolism, right? They were trying to detect living things that were eating, excreting, and putting out some kind of sign of life. And more recently, the rover missions have instead been looking at, well, what do the rocks say about where the water was? And if we know that life as we know it can't exist without water, if we can figure out what were the wet environments, maybe we can find some microorganism sort of hanging on in some kind of environment. Because, we know that we have microorganisms on Earth, bacteria that live in incredibly inhospitable situations. We know that we have life clinging, sort of whole ecosystems really built around these deep sea hydrothermal vents and the chemical environments that they create. And we know that we have life forms that live in incredibly cold environments, hot environments, salty environments, places that we would think of as just totally toxic. So why couldn't there be some microorganism living in an extremely cold and mostly dry place on Mars, just if there's just enough water there? And then from that, you go to the idea of, well, we've looked in some of these places and we still haven't found anything. Maybe our goal should be to find fossilized evidence of life that may have existed at some point in the past. And, so the question keeps essentially being the same. Did life ever emerge on Mars? But the ways of thinking about that question and answering it have changed. And every now and then you do see a report. There was another headline this week about, one of the rovers having found something that's very difficult to explain just by non-biological processes, right? Chemicals that get discovered that usually on Earth we know are associated with life. And it's always going to be an open question as to whether or not they've really found that when you're dealing with the rovers. That's why I think sample return has been on the agenda for Mars science for a long time, and why a lot of people believe it will be a very important moment for Mars science, because you know the rovers allowed us to ground truth a lot that had been seen from orbit that oftentimes became more complicated once you were seeing it up close with the rover. getting those samples actually into a lab and being able to look at them through microscopes, and handle them with the instruments that we have in laboratories here on Earth would probably do much the same thing. Show us that, in fact, what we've been seeing with the rovers is much more of a simpler story than what we actually see when we look at the rocks. So I think either sample return or an actual human laboratory on Mars or in orbit around Mars is going to change what we know about Mars. As for, as to the question of whether it will actually find life, that's a question I can't answer. But myself personally, I'm hopeful that we will discover some evidence of life on Mars or, on Europa again, with the Europa Clipper. What we're hoping to find, or what scientists are hoping to find, is something like what we know can exist. As I mentioned, those hydrothermal vents where you have basically life existing without sunlight, without what we think life requires or used to think life requires, but instead living just off of the heat and the chemicals that are being released by the Earth itself. So underneath those, the ice of Europa in that liquid ocean, could there be that type of environment? That right now is an open question that hopefully Europa Clipper will be able to begin to answer. And I would say another thing about how the emphasis has shifted in the same way that the emphasis of looking for life on Mars has shifted, is that instead of talking about looking for life in the universe or in the solar system these days, scientists talk about looking for habitability, right? The conditions under which life could exist or could have formed. Because that, in some ways, is an easier question to answer than did life emerge anytime in the last billions of years, which, of course, unless you find that, very specific evidence, you can't really answer. So yeah, that's I think how I would want to answer that question. But then the other thing it has less to do with life and more to do with just our understanding of the solar system is that, it was a huge moment when Apollo astronauts were able to bring back rock samples from the moon. What was learned from those samples being analyzed on Earth really transformed what we knew about the history of planetary formation and the history of the evolution of the planets in the solar system. It allowed us to put dates on large impact events that affected the moon and probably affected the entire inner solar system. So that's where we get the ideas of, the different periods of bombardment in the solar system, is from taking the more sort of observational evidence that had been seen through telescopes and through orbiters on the moon of where the craters were, how they related to each other in terms of stratigraphy and timescales, and then putting dates on that timescale by being able to bring back rocks from the moon and study them.